Hello and welcome to the Young Film Academy podcast, the essential podcast for teenagers looking to find their way in the creative industries. And I'm James Walker, and I have done a podcast hijack live from the Media Production Technology Show. And we're here with our partners Canon, and we are doing a video version of this podcast as well. So this will be available. So if you're listening to the audio, do go on the usual channels and you should be able to see the video version of this podcast. Now, I am delighted to have with us some people who can talk about money. That's what we're going to be unpicking today. So we have Steve Potts, who is a partner at Helion Partners. Welcome, Steve. Lovely to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
And you're joined by Jessica Bradley, who is an associate also at Helion Partners. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi, great to be here.
So, money. So this is the money. So actually, this is the first time on the Young Film Academy podcast that we've really delved into money. And I myself have a background as a producer, and so I know how important the money is, because without the money, things don't happen. I do think that it's a tough one for young people, the money aspect, because especially film and television, a lot of young people come from a theatre background where they may have had the experience of really with no money at all, being able to print a script, get a few friends. Maybe their school's got a stage. They can get people up on the stage. Maybe they have to buy a few props or something, but not much. 100 quid, 200 quid, and you're away. You can put something up. The school's often got lights, a bit of sound. So there's no real money involved. But when you start making films or television, obviously, there's just so much. I mean, we're here at this show live at London Olympia, and the Media Production Technology Show is just full of shiny bits of kit. I think, Steve, you were slightly geeking out there.
I was thinking about how much it would cost to fit the house out with all of the kit that's here, and it's out of my means.
It's an awful lot. So it becomes a lot, and there's so many things that we can talk about what makes film and television such an expensive medium. So I think it's really good that we can take time here to sort of talk a little bit about that, and we're going to ask some pretty basic questions, and we're going to kind of unpick it. And I think the second thing to say is that there will be some listeners, I think, out there who maybe the more creative roles in film and television is something that maybe they're not so interested in, or maybe they've just made a lifestyle choice and they want to do something in finance. And maybe they're going to listen to this and think, well, hold on, there's a whole area of finance where I can tie that to my love of film and television and that world. So I suppose maybe, Steve, you could kick us off by just give us a sense of what is it that you guys at Helion do, and if that's multiple things, just sort of unpick it a bit for us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Helion Partners' core business is M&A advisory. So M&A, a bit of jargon there to bust straight
away.
Mergers and acquisitions, which is the general term for when a company might be sold to a new company or new owners, equally might be bought, and also covers various aspects of fundraising or funding, usually at company level, as opposed to, say, funding a specific project. Although one tends to be thinking about film and television as funding the projects that we then see on the big screens. So mergers and acquisitions, funding or ownership of the companies that might be producing, changing hands, is the sort of broad.
Okay, so let me try and sort of say that back to you. So a merger and acquisition, so you've got a company that may have had some success or maybe not. I suppose there's different types of those sales. Yep. Some are kind of what we might call fire sales, which is like, this is not going well, I want to get out. Or on the opposite hand, this is going very well, I want to sell my company to somebody else. And you guys are doing what in that process?
The key area for us is working with founders of companies who have taken the company so far and then maybe want to what we call de-risk. So they sell down some of their ownership, but they will typically stay with the company for a period of time, either to the point where they completely exit the company and it has a new owner, or they work with the new owner in a sort of partnership to take the company to new heights. So in some instances, the company might have identified a route to growth, and there's a need for capital to grow the company.
Let's just take a fit. So route to growth, what is a route to growth?
So you can imagine, let's say if we take a film production company and it has 3 completed films under its belt, and maybe it's won some awards, and the owners of the company have sort of identified 5, 6, 7 new projects which they feel creatively they're ready to get off the ground, but in order to do that they need to expand their internal operations,
more people, bigger offices, exactly, all that stuff,
because there's more to do, and also to seed fund the new projects. So to get the projects to a certain level, they're going to have to start spending money on that specific project. So in that instance, the owners aren't thinking of, I'm ready to sort of throw in the towel, or it's not a fire sale, in to use the term you used, but actually there's a desire to grow and find good partners to grow with. And if the good partners to grow with happen to have a checkbook and the wherewithal to invest and help on that growth journey, that can be a perfect match.
And so you help the sellers largely to find a sort of match. It's not matchmaking. It's financial matchmaking to some degree.
It is to some degree, yes. And although Helion Partners does a variety of things, a key part of what we do is helping owners sell a stake in their business to the right partners. So maybe we'll rename Helion Matchmakers down the line, but yeah, that's certainly a part of it, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And Jessica, what is your role then in sort of the process that Steve has just outlined? What is your part of that?
So where we focus is on TV production companies. So recently we sold The Forge, who do Buccaneers, to Banijay. And we have recently sold Australian company Werner, who have produced Surviving Summer and Crazy Fun Park to BBC Studios. So we advise, work with the founders to develop a business plan, see how we can help their business to grow, and then hold their hands through the whole process, introducing them to a variety of different buyers, meeting with them, working alongside them, and then going into exclusivity, so a period where they're just talking to the potential buyers, due diligence, so looking at all different aspects of their business, all of the legal contracts, all of the accounts for the last few years, holding their hands through that process.
Essentially to make sure that whoever's buying it isn't buying a pup. I mean,
Exactly.
it is what it says it is.
So they know what they're buying.
Got you. Because I mean, there is a tendency, right, for people to feel that the money side of things is quite dry. You know, there will be that amongst young people. They'll still be like, oh, God, it's the money. Oh. You know, they switch off. Whereas if you say, it's, hey, who wants to talk about the stunts or the lights or the performances or whatever, then they kind of, their eyes light up. But there is actually a lot of, you know, human stuff that has to happen in this world for this to work well. It's not dry. There is obviously a dry element to some degree. It's contracts and it's accounts and those things that need to be the paperwork in the right order. So I suppose, first of all, are there other people doing what you do at Helion? Are you one of many kind of matchmakers like this, or is it quite a small pool of organisations like yours?
Yeah, there's a lot there, actually. So in terms of the question, there are certainly other advisors. There's a sort of, within what's called investment banking, I guess, which is a slightly sort of Americanism sort of term, boutique investment banks or boutique advisory firms are the phrases that and titles that come out for organisations like us, and there are several of those. I don't actually know of an advisory group like us that specialise and have such a track record in television production, which is the division that Jess works in. So we're quite specialists as far as that goes. And then the other activities outside of TV production that we specialise in at Helion tend to be in media, entertainment and marketing. So we're sector specialists. There are other sector specialist firms out there, but not necessarily with quite as weighted towards entertainment, I would say. And in terms of the interesting point you make about the sort of dryness of finance, there are so many aspects to finance in film and indeed in all industries, actually. But the one thing that was lost on me, certainly, until my career took a different path and I was more involved in finance matters, is the story that the numbers tell. So in film production, everyone talks about the storytelling and the storytellers and the story beats and the character arcs and all of those things that are sort of an essential part of making film or TV. Well, actually, in what we do, it's about the story behind the numbers and understanding the numbers often better than our clients understand their own numbers, insofar as the sort of detailed analysis that goes into the work that we do that presents companies in a particular sort of light, so that we can really understand not only the story to date, but what the future episodes of the story might look like in financial terms.
That's fascinating, because I actually used to do, back in the day, I did some sort of corporate workshops as a screenwriter, where I would sort of go into an organization that had nothing to do with film and television, and I would teach them the essential beats of narrative storytelling, because as you referred to, like, the sense of a story is essential to anything that people do within an organization. You need a story so that people know, first of all, what they're involved in and that what to aspire to and where they're going and what the goal is and all this fascinating. So I suppose what you're saying is that a deal, if you just take the mergers and acquisition side, the idea of a company that wants to sell itself to somebody else, and you're the intermediary in the middle, you're the matchmaker. I suppose you're looking at what story, again, maybe let's play with this matchmaking metaphor. You need to work out what of that person you're going to bring out in the story that's going to particularly appeal to this particular person that you might match them with. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's right in certain cases. I mean, in other cases, there's a process in very recent memory where, through the analysis that we did in terms of the historical information of the company, we were actually to sort of point out to the founders that there was a particular opportunity for going forward, which not only was an opportunity in itself for the business, but would also be a particular interest to certain companies looking to acquire in this area. So there's certainly a depth of analysis that we go into, and there are times when our inner numbers geeks come out and you know, we're going into sort of great detail, and there are other times when, to go back to your phrase, that the matchmaking is partly about the numbers, but also very particularly about the personalities involved and perhaps the IPs that the companies have created. So there's a whole range of how detailed and different the story and the numbers might be, anything from it is what it says on the tin to something that is really quite complex and has multiple strands to it.
Got you. And Jessica, you're involved in the valuation side, are you? Do you help to kind of work out what a company is worth when it's sold, a media company?
Yeah, so we won't put a price tag on a company, but that's for the buyers to come up with. So
it's great. I can't wait for this.
So
it's great. It's like walking to a shop. How much the banana?
Yes.
Or how much are you going to pay?
It's exactly like that. It's not like buying a house where you can scroll through Rightmove and see that this one is worth X amount, that one's worth what. It's a judgment exercise. So we'll guide the buyers on how they might like to look at valuing the company, but we won't give hard and fast the price tag is.
Okay, so you are mentioning numbers. I mean, you're not going in with just like no idea. Is this 100 million, 50 million, 2 million, 500,000? I mean, you're giving them some sense.
Yeah, we'll guide them on the multiples that are to be used. So typically a company is valued on a multiple of its maintainable EBITDA, which is a
that's
big...
Oh, right, let's just pull that.
Jargon alert.
A big jargon.
Here we go, right. Say that phrase again.
So it's valued on a multiple of its maintainable EBITDA.
EBITDA, I think that's a planet in Star Wars.
Yes, it probably
EBITDA.
is.
I remember in The Mandalorian, I think he goes to EBITDA. Right, so right. So I thought that evaluation was based on a company's annual profit.
Yes.
But that's
that's roughly what it is. So EBITDA in its long form is earnings before amortization, depreciation, interest, and tax.
Okay, right. So we are going to delve into it, but that may be just that may be a bridge too far. So let's just call that profit.
Profit. It's at the end of the day, it's the profit. It's a rough estimation of how much cash the business is bringing in.
Got you. And for young listeners, profit is basically, you get money in for the thing that is, so media companies selling shows to streamers or cinemas or agents of some sort. And so you get money in, and then it costs you money to make that show. Locations, cameras, lights, actors, all the rights, all those things. And basically, hopefully, a profit is that you get more in than you spend in the making of the thing. So let's make this real, because I think, let's make this plastic. So I'm going to start a new company, guys, right here, right now. And I'm making a show, and it's all about, I'm being inspired by what I can see out there. It's all about plants. I can see a big green sign for plants. So I'm making nature shows, and I make some, and I make, it costs me, let's make the numbers, so it costs me £100 to make the show. But someone's paid me £200 to buy my show. So I've made approximately in a year £100. So what you're saying is you take that number of 100 approximately,
yep,
and you're applying some multiplier. Can you explain that bit?
Yes. So if you'd not necessarily made one show, but if you'd been making multiple shows, so you did the same last year and the year before, and so you wasn't just a one trick, you've got this one breakout hit, and realistically you're not going to do that again. You were a one-hit wonder, and that's done. So if you've done that, proved that over multiple years,
you need a track record,
and some visibility going forward. So someone's seen your great show, and they're thinking maybe we could get another one of those for next year, and maybe we could do one rather than about plants. It's also about trees as well.
Yep.
And so we typically they then multiply that by somewhere between 7 and 10 times.
Okay.
So taking the lower end of that scale.
So in my case, for my production company, £700 or £1,000.
Yep. So we
approximately,
roughly, and that would be.
That's the sort of gauge, and then you've
got value on the business.
The value on the business, I see. And I mean, I suppose you hear all these sharky stories of deals where, especially with the, certain individuals in America who make deals who are quite famous for this sort of thing, who may be running for president. You go in with this. Almost you start at a ludicrous number. Do you know what I mean? Where you're trying to paradigm shift the whole negotiation to your favor. So it's equivalent of, let's say we do that little thing about my business, right? And say between us, because you're helping me here, we think that's about £700 to £1,000. But we go in and we say to them, we're looking for about 10,000 for this business. Are you just so that when and if we settle at around 3,000, they think they're getting a phenomenal deal because we started that at 10. Now, I've heard of that in other spheres of life. Does that ever happen in your sphere?
Not quite going in and saying we think it's probably 100, but we're going to ask for 10,000. Probably not quite to that extreme, but often if we've got multiple offers from different companies, you can use that competitive tension to say, well, maybe, to be the preferred bidder, you should increase your multiple a little bit. Maybe we're looking more to the 8 times than the 7 times. Or maybe we should be focusing on next year's profit rather than this year's profit. And so there's lots of little ways that you can use, especially when you think there's multiple people that are interested in the company.
Got you. Because you want a bidding war, don't you? I mean, that's what you're
exactly.
Really, that's the best when you've got, I don't know. And how many, Steve, if you have, in a really good case, let's say you've got a really hot company that's had a really big hit show, they've got others coming up, they want to sell a part or all of their business at that stage. How many people might be interested in your experience? Are we talking like maximum 2, 3, or sometimes is it 20?
Yeah, I mean, it varies a lot depending on the asset or the company that you're representing. I mean, there was one, not in the TV production space, but there was one very large M&A transaction which I led on some years ago, and straight off the bat there were 14 expressions of interest, all of whom were wanting to go into exclusivity as soon as possible. It was extremely high sort of multiple basis valuation in the minds of the acquirers, but the specific thing there, which from time to time does apply to TV production, film production, etc., was the very specific IP, if you like, that's
IP, intellectual property.
that
What
was
does that mean?
that was in the company. So in the context of what we're discussing, that might be a particular TV show or a particular film title.
Bluey, for instance, which is now a huge. I heard recently it's a third of the watches on Disney Plus is Bluey.
Yeah,
current.
extraordinary.
I mean, apps extraordinary.
Yeah, extraordinary. And a slight aside, but I remember it must be a good 18 months ago or so, and maybe even longer actually. I might be getting the timescale wrong, but before Bluey was really sort of known to the extent it is now.
Bluey, by the way, is the kids show about Australian dogs, and it's absolutely beautifully made.
Yeah,
it's incredible.
It was the one to watch. It was the one to watch. Someone I know in that space had said that's the next one to come right up in terms of valuation, like Peppa Pig did, and sort of other brands. So that's what I mean when I sort of say IP. So I think that the sort of case that Jess is talking about, you can imagine, e.g. production companies, there's a known market for it, so there's the sort of precedent, which is previous deals, knowing what the multiples might have been paid, and there's a framework and structure, at least for a starting point. So if you're to go in and say, here's James's company, it's regularly making £100 a year, and so we want £10,000 for it, the buyer's going to want to know there must be something really special about James or the company he's built. And by the way, James, you're a very special guy. But you know, that's a big number.
Yeah,
that's a big multiple.
It's so you start to talk about the multiplier becomes the thing. It's like, listen, I'll talk about a 7, but we're not going to go to a 15 multiplier. Forget it. Get out of town. Okay, so I've got I'm thinking of selling I've made this show about plants. Maybe I've got a track record, so I did trees before, and I've done all this stuff. And now I'm thinking of selling up or selling a part. Let's deal with that aspect, because I think when I first heard of this, I sort of assumed that you just sell. I more or less just hand over the keys to the offices, and someone owns the company, and they now employ the staff, and the shows and the rights are theirs, and I'm out and I try and go surfing or something. But I think it's not usually like that. So maybe, Jess, you could take us through what kind of... Do people still stay in the company once they've sold it? How does that work?
Yeah, so typically a company's a majority sold on day one. So typically 51%, which means that the company that's bought is then able to take all of the profits of the company and consolidate them into their own numbers. So they can then say that your £100 that you've made on your plants show is now their £100 in their accounts, even though you still own 49% of the shares yourself.
Oh, that's interesting, because they've just got that tiny fractional bit more ownership that means they are majority owners, that they can essentially take all the profit and use it as they want.
Yeah, so their accounting profit. So
this is getting technical, because there's a difference between kind of what the accounts do slightly and what the real world is. I mean,
so it's the difference between the accounts and the profit in the profit and loss and the cash in the bank account.
Okay, got you.
Is the distinction there?
Okay, so I'm looking to sell up, but I can hold 49. So I can sell 51% of my company, and then is it usual that people who own the companies before stick around for a time? Because I suppose if I was the buyer, I would want them to stick around for a while because they're good at the thing they've done. I mean, and I'm not necessarily. And so how does that dynamic play out?
So the remaining 49% is typically sold over a 5 to 8 year period. So you have to stay in the company for that period in order to get the value for the shares. So if you've just you sold roughly half of your shares. So say it was £1,000 that was the final valuation that was settled on. You're then going to get £500 for those half of your shares, and you want to, or 500.
So on day one.
As
soon as they buy, I got £500.
£510.
Yeah. Okay. Got you. Yeah.
And so you then have to perform for the rest of the business plan, so the rest of the period of the earn out, in order to get the value for the remaining 49% of your shares. Otherwise, you're losing half the value of your business.
I see. So because they, the buyer, are incentivizing me, who knows how to make shows about plants and trees. They want to keep me, and they want to make sure that I'm, because I mean, there's a bit of danger that I'd be like, well, that's not my thing anymore. So I sit back, I don't turn up to work, all that stuff. But actually, if I stick with, they make it as carrots. It's a carrot. So there's a giant carrot to say, keep earning as much and making as good stuff as you can until the end buyout. And then at the end of that period of about 5 years, is it typical that then someone has literally, they now don't own any of the business, they exit and they go and start another one, probably, don't they?
So typically there's then a renegotiation, and a re-incentivization is cooked up between, in a similar kind of fashion, with new projects going forward, going into a different company and starting again, but with the same buyer. So often people have had good experiences with the companies that they've worked with, and so they want to stick around. So they want to do the same deal again, and there'll be similar incentivization going forward.
Got you.
Or occasionally, if you're coming to the end of your career, then you might be out. You might just want to go and sit on a beach and go surfing all day.
Yeah, got you. And Steve, would I be right in saying that kind of most of these sales is sort of a smaller partner selling to a bigger partner? Is that usually how this works? That the buyer is a kind of bigger media conglomerate. I mean, you hear about these huge media companies that own, and maybe you can talk, because some of the household names, and maybe you can talk, that kind of all are actually owned by the same media company, but their names people have heard, and they might not be aware that they're all owned by the same. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And are those the sort of buyers that are often in these scenarios?
Yeah, in the specific sector that we're talking about, most typically the acquiring company will be a larger company than the smaller company. You may hear things like reverse acquisition, where it's the other way around, and there's a wide variety of financial structures that are possible. But more typically, particularly in, I think, TV production in the sector that Jess specialises in, it's a larger company buying a smaller company. And the other thing to sort of reflect on, I think, in terms of the question you were asking about the structure and what happens after the initial transaction, as we call it, is and the way I think about it, particularly in this sector, is the owner of that company is often the talent. So it's their talent and ability and networks and everything else that have created, let's say, the TV shows about plants and trees, and maybe the sequel's going to be about flowers. But it's their talent and their particular take on the shows that they've produced and that are intending to produce going forward. So they're a kind of critical cog in the wheel. Which I suppose can be a double-edged sword. I mean, if the owner, you've had enough of flowers, trees and plants and you really do want to leave, that's one scenario. But actually you've got 3, 4, 5 other ideas that you want to carry on sort of doing this forever. That's another scenario. And we certainly deal with founders and owners who might fall into one or both of those categories, or anything in between.
Got you. And could you just speak a moment about this sort of media conglomeration, which means a group of companies all as one? Like, can you give us a sense, the kind of, the names that we hear, are they often under actually one giant company? Is that the landscape for those bigger?
It's a varied landscape. It is a varied landscape. I mean, obviously, there are some of the big players and the household names that we hear about. There are also more sort of mid-scale kind of independent companies that are looking to acquire smaller companies because they can see the growth potential in the smaller companies, and also what we call synergies, which is where when the combination of the two companies, effectively synergies in costs, mean that they have lower combined running costs. Because certain departments don't need
to account teams.
Exactly, yeah. So there's things like that. But it is a varied landscape. On the broader entertainment and media side of what Helium Partners do, so just stepping outside of TV production for a second, there's an even wider landscape of deal types and structures and ownership structures. And that's where you sort of, for all of the precedent information and sort of past experience and history that you have, what we try to do is always be focusing on the absolute specific circumstances and needs of our clients, usually the person who's selling, to try and create a solution that is most suitable for them and their needs, which will include finding the right partner and not always necessarily being at the highest valuation, because there may be a sort of a judgment as to whether actually one partner might be offering a bit more money, but are they
less good long-term fit?
Exactly,
matchmaking
less
again.
good fit. Back to the matchmaking. Yeah.
Fascinating. And let's put some numbers on this, some real. I know we've been using kind of hundreds and £1,000 because it's a nice easy way to think about it. But I mean, I remember when I was a young person getting into this world, and I do remember actually I started in theatre, and I remember we did a show. We must have been 17, I think, 16, 17, and we were going to try and raise some money and take a shot to the Edinburgh Fringe. That was the idea. And one of our group, there were 4 of us, and one of our group was a bit reluctant because actually they were much more practically minded than we are. And they're like, well, how are we it's going to cost a lot. And I remember someone in the group came out with this phrase that became immortalised: 300 quid and up to Edinburgh. So basically we'd sort of, and we used this phrase to sort of browbeat the gentleman, the young man who didn't want to do it. And we're like, but it's 300 quid and up to Edinburgh, because basically we'd worked out the train ticket to Edinburgh times 4. But I mean, we hadn't thought about, all the myriad costs. We were just so unbelievably naive. But those are the numbers we were used to, right?
Yeah.
And I have my own kids, and I know if you say numbers, it's either basically $1 billion or $1 trillion, or it's a number they can understand, like 12 or 15 or 40. And so I remember when I heard movies, well, it's like someone, 5 million to make a movie. I mean, just these numbers was utterly meaningless, but they are big numbers. So when one's selling a successful media company that's putting out TV shows, what sort of numbers, and we're not going to get specific, but let's get a range here. What might these numbers actually be?
Well, the valuation ranges are considerable. One thing that I think might be interesting to you and your listeners is to think about the fact that when we talk about money in the abstract, it's quite hard for anyone to think what's the difference between 10 million or 100 million or $1 billion, because it's all very, very abstract. And one thing we do hear about a lot in film production is budgets on big blockbuster films. And we're continually hearing about 100+ million budgets on these films, or
per episode in
TV
shows.
Exactly. So it's millions and millions per episode. And it's quite interesting to try and put some meaning to those numbers. So on the one hand, there are some people in certain roles, and we can think about star actors as a starting point, who get paid a lot of money per episode. So we know that that's where some of the money's going. But then if you think about and look into the creativity that goes into an episode or a movie, and the technology that's required to produce that particular look or that particular scene, and then the post-production that goes into that, and then you've made something, but you've got to market it, and that right from beginning to development through to the end result, very big numbers and big budgets. But then think about the man hours that have gone into that. Hundreds of thousands of hours and gone into sort of creating that, and the uncertainty on the journey,
the risk. Well-established production companies, they know what they're doing, but they don't always make hits all of the time. So the thing I always find quite interesting and fascinating is when you sort of start to break down and look at where the money has been spent on some of these big projects, and then interestingly, what proportion of a project income flows into the production company that we might then be advising in a sale. So there's multiple layers and parts to it, and I think that if you're minded to just learn more about finance, because maybe you're not sure what part of production you want to get into, or whether or not you want to be in finance, but are sort of intrigued by it, the one thing I can guarantee is it's highly layered, highly colourful. There's sort of myriad opportunities in there, and the numbers always tell a story. But to come back to press you on the numbers, a low range to a high range, if I was to sell, if I'd had some fairly decent household hits that people might recognize, and I was selling my production company on the basis that I've got some cool stuff coming up and in the pipeline, what sort of numbers? 50 million sounds like a low number to you, or quite a high number? 100?
I'm trying to think of the range.
Like low, high range.
The highest that I've heard of was Reese Witherspoon's company, Hello Sunshine.
Okay.
That had price tags bounded around of close to $1 billion, which is very, very high. But so
got you. So that might be the high end.
That's kind of sky's the limit at that point, really.
Yeah.
And low end or the lower range?
You can have anything. I would have said, you have deals that are done for a few £100,000.
Got you. Okay, so it's a really huge range.
It's a massive range. Yeah.
That's
why you found it hard to pin me down. It's a big range.
It's almost anything. And so aside from the sort of the mergers and acquisitions side of things, people selling companies to other people, you also have some experience, I think, particularly Steve, on raising money for films, which will be a very big and interesting thing, I think, for young people listening, because as I say, the difficulty for a lot of our young filmmakers at Young Film Academy, outside of the courses that we run, is they then say, well, it's great, I come on Young Film Academy course, you've got locations, you've got all the equipment, you've got all the lights, you've got all the people, you've got script writers who are students who write the script, we've got everything we need. But when I try and do this at home, suddenly I've got to travel and transport, and even if I'm just paying sandwiches, I've got to pay that, and it gets expensive. And so they quite quickly start looking at, I've got to raise money to make this film. Maybe it's £200, maybe it's £1,000, maybe it's £2,000. So I suppose talk us through a little bit about your experiences of financing. Is it in individual film projects, and at what kinds of levels, and sort of how does that happen professionally at that scale?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, in my experience, I've worked on, I don't know, a dozen or so films over the years, and usually in an executive producer capacity, with a sort of weighting towards finance and operations. So I've played a variety of roles in as an exec producer, but broadly that. I mean, there's many component parts to financing a project. Some of the smaller independent films or short films or so on are financed through family and friends. It's literally knocking on doors and asking people if they would like to support your project.
That's how I started. I started selling shares. £20 a share we sold it for our first
there
film.
You go.
And we made a certificate. We sent it out.
Very good. Well, that's interesting and quite sophisticated that you've gone about it as selling shares, because I know some people who've done a crowdfund and they don't articulate it in that way. It's more articulated, and probably correctly, as a donation. Because short films are very hard to sort of recoup the investment, but they may lead to bigger and better things. So that's one of the reasons why we do them. So very sort of wide range of financing opportunities. There are certain grants and things that people can apply for. That's not been a particular part of my direct experience, but I would say one area which I have seen time and again is either financing a film project through a high net worth or ultra high net worth individuals. So these are people who are very wealthy. They have therefore usually not usually, but sometimes a higher appetite for risk investments. So they might have a mixed portfolio where they're investing in stocks,
which is shares in
stocks and shares in companies that are publicly traded. So there's a liquidity, which means you can buy and sell and sort of have your money invested, but then bring it out if it's publicly traded. And shares can go up and down in value, as I'm sure you know. To having a portfolio, maybe a lower proportion of the overall portfolio for alternative investments, and that might be investments into.
So we had a few of these for films that I've produced, where you get a sort of a small group of high net worth individuals who basically did it for fun. It was basically they just wanted to hang around quite fun, creative people and have a fun life experience. And there was also ways often where there would be kind of tax schemes that we don't need to go into now, but basically the idea was, if you're wealthy and you're going to pay a lot of tax, if you put money into films and the film doesn't do anything and you lose that money, you can actually offset it against the other tax you're going to pay. So it sort of doesn't really matter as much that you lose that money. So I suppose it's making the risk, which it is by putting money into film, it's making it a bit less of a risk, because you're not going to lose all the money you put in, even if you do lose it all, because you'll sort of recoup it back from tax you would otherwise have paid.
Yeah, I think that's right. The tax relief on losses, and there's different sort of types of that, can be part of the incentive. But I think usually in that instance, the piece you were saying about the interest in the industry and the people in the industry, and perhaps even meeting some of the actors and so on and so forth, is a big part of the incentive.
Going to the premiere, being positive.
Exactly.
Film does have, when it's done right, that magical quality that lights people up and you know, gives a bit of glamour and things. When actually the process of making it is often not very glamorous, but the end results can be.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the other key factor when you're sort of moving up the scale in production, there's always a mantra that I've sort of lived with as a producer as I was, which was don't produce in isolation. So if you're entirely funding something by yourself or from a single source, and you get to the end and there's an end product, what you haven't had the benefit of along the journey is a diverse investor base where you've actually sort of hedged your own investment to an extent, or your lead investors, but the experience
that's the money that you've put into the project. It's not all about you. So there's other people involved in the risk as well.
Other people involved in the risk, other people bringing their experience to the table, their counsel, their voice to the table, and hopefully some of those other investors or investment partners are people who will play a material part of the film's release down the line. So some films, for instance, are funded by selling the future rights. For once the film is made, you might sell certain territories, i.e. countries, in advance of making the film, so that helps fund the film, and then the income from that other country who have invested, a distributor in a particular territory, the income that generates will then go back to them until they've recouped their investment, and then there'll be some sort of share of the money thereafter.
That's right. And can you just break down for us where a sales agent comes into that process? Because so you've got someone wants to make a film, they say, I'm gonna, I need to raise, whatever the number is. And so a sales agent comes in and says, right, well, I can pre-sell it to certain territories, countries in advance that will pay us a certain amount of money to get the right to get it when it's been made, and that helps to build a proportion of the budget, right?
That's right. You've summarized that very well. And the sales agents relationships with all of the key distributors in multiple territories is the key there, and that's kind of what you're buying into. And the sales agent might charge sometimes a sort of administrative fee to start with, or they might be remunerated as a percentage of the money that they bring in, or a mixture of the two.
Yeah. And then there's this thing called, which I always think is very, very misleading. It's called that the UK's just announced a better one in April. Was it for tax relief? They always call it the UK tax relief on film production, which makes it sound like it's a relief on some tax, but it really should be called the Film Cashback Fund, I think, because that's, we all understand cashback. Go and spend money at Tesco's, and if you spend £100 on a particular item, we'll give you £20 back, which is essentially, as I understand it, the way this scheme works. And the UK now have one of 40%. You have to qualify as a UK film, I believe, and deal with this. But the idea is essentially, and Jessica, are you familiar with this? Do you deal with these funds? So you spend £100 and the UK government will more or less give you a cheque for 40 back. Is that how it works?
Yeah, there's a similar concept in TV production as well. So it's currently it's the high-end TV tax credit, and I think that's changing slightly as of next year, I think. It's exactly as you say. You get.
But you've got to have the money to begin with, don't you?
That's got to have the money to begin with. So often you can get that financed for the bigger productions through banks.
When we say finance, we mean borrow money. Yeah.
So sometimes banks will loan it. If you've got a company that's already got a lot of cash from previous productions, then they can cash flow it themselves. But yeah.
And at the end of the process, you get that 40% or well, quite a large chunk, and it varies place to place. And this is a feature of why certain countries, of which the UK is actually one, are actually quite popular for foreign productions coming. And it's partly to do with the talent base, and it's partly to do with the facilities, that we're a good place for both of those things. But there's also this element, and you hear about certain countries that maybe don't have quite such a good talent base and don't have quite such good facilities, but they offer a very good tax relief,
incentive,
cashback, we should call it, movie cashback or TV cashback. And so people go, oh great, because I can get 50% of my budget by simply saying I'm shooting in whatever the place is.
That's right. And actually that's a good sort of segue into part of the colour and range of finance in film, the role of finance in film and TV, because what you're doing there is you're considering various trade-offs. You might have an incentive from a local tax perspective to move your production and shoot in another country. You then have to consider, but then I've got to get everyone there, so there's a cost to that. And then you have to consider production facilities, so certain aspects of maybe the equipment or studios that are needed for your film, you can't transport them, so you're going to use what's local. Is that as good quality, and so on and so forth. So there's always a trade-off somewhere, but part of the role of financing a film production, for instance, or television, is determining what's the best balance between what we want to achieve financially and producing to budget and sources of finance, and weighing that up against some of the creative decisions and the operational decisions.
Actually, I have a friend who's just been looking at directing a film, and they're trying to hire him. That they plan shoot in Canada, and the idea has been it's been part of it's a good place for tax incentives to do that. But actually, the locations don't seem, at first instance, to really work. So my friend's actually very keen. He thinks it'd be much better in the UK, where there's certain places, locations. There you go. It's sort of all there, ready to go, and they've been a bit reluctant to do that. But now they're thinking about building all this stuff in Canada instead, when they could just use a location in the UK. And now, of course, they're looking at the budget, and it's way too much. So
that's a good example.
It's the swings and roundabouts.
It's the swings and roundabouts, and it's the trade-offs. And then, of course, the other thing that's sort of come into play a bit more recently is virtual production, whereby you can use technology to recreate certain scenes that you may have traditionally flown the cast to, let's say, Barbados or somewhere nice and warm and far away, and film there. Whereas actually there are certain scenarios where you can use technology to recreate certain locations, and so that then becomes into the mix.
So sort of creative. So there is that creative element of looking at the overall picture of a budget for a thing that is a whole series of scenes and actors and locations, and all that, and finding creative ways to make the thing happen for the money available.
That's right. And what you find, or certainly my experience in production, is you're working with a variety of people. So let's say, if we line up 5 people with the job title producer, let's say, some of those people will have a very good grasp of finance and intimate knowledge of budgeting and the nuances of production finance, and some will not, and they will have different creative skills, people skills, etc., etc. So there's always a sliding scale of.
It's such a producer is such a wide term. We actually, when we go into schools at Young Film Academy and we ask what does a producer do, inevitably the hands go up. Produce.
Like, yes.
Yeah, but it is to some extent meaningless. But I suppose you're helping to produce the thing. And talking of producing the thing, I mean, I know that as a producer, things can go wrong. They can go very bad. So I suppose, can you maybe give us an example of, from a finance perspective, maybe Jessica, you can come in on this, something that you can remember where something hasn't gone very well with some sort of results? What kind of things do you see? Is this a lack of trust? Is it a company pretending that the numbers are all really good and that they've got all this stuff, but actually the company buying under the hood sees it's a very different picture once they've actually bought it? I mean, you hear these stories of companies, they think they're buying a nice shiny thing, and then when they drive the company home, to use the metaphor, they realize that the motor is all a bit rusty and all that stuff. What kind of things go wrong?
Yeah, thankfully we have never seen it happen like that, as you say, where you look under the hood and actually it's a completely different story. The role that we play is making sure that everything is open and transparent from the outset. So thankfully we've never had that situation where we've gone in and actually as soon as the buyers looked under the hood, the numbers have actually all fallen apart and there's nothing there. We've
got you. Does the money sometimes not arrive? Is it a briefcase of money needs to be here like a movie? Got to be here by 2 to close the deal, and the money's not there.
It's a lot less glamorous than that, unfortunately. Nowadays, it's all DocuSign and emails being sent round. So thankfully, we've not had too many disasters so far. I'm not sure.
People pull out the last moment. Do you ever get that? You know, you see that in movies. You know, just about a sign for the big thing where the corporation's about to be sold, and
I think certainly one of the things that we've seen from time to time, although not in the TV production division necessarily, is a change of circumstances. So that there can certainly be a situation where, for instance, the company that is intending to acquire a smaller company, they have an internal change which is outside of the control of the vendor, outside of the control of the advisor, if that's our role in that instance. And so a deal can stall or stop at that point. Hopefully in those scenarios there was more than one interested party, so there is another route to travel. But certainly, you know, we're aware of scenarios like that. And the global pandemic, which upset the apple cart in sort of every corner of society in the world, particularly hit the performance and balance sheets of companies.
Of course, because suddenly for a year you basically are a zero. So then the multiplier thing is interesting.
That's right. So understanding. And as Jess said when she was explaining the multiples, it was about the normalized EBITDA or the sustainable EBITDA figure, because what that's then doing is dealing with outlying circumstances.
One year you had a massive hit and tons of money, and then the next year you were in development, and so nothing really got sold.
Yeah.
So it's basically trying to level out.
Yeah.
That's the planet EBITDA. It's the leveling out.
Planet EBITDA. That's what it's about. And so so there are certainly external factors that can rock a deal or stall things from time to time. Hopefully there are other paths to travel. And one of the things, we're extremely founder and owner conscious and focused. We see our role partly as really looking after the owners, because we're entrepreneurs ourselves. We're a relatively small team. We're a team of entrepreneurs, essentially, all of the partners at Helion. We've all run our own businesses and so on and so forth. And so we get it.
Yeah.
And it's really important.
And it can be super stressful. I mean, very stressful time for the humans involved in these things.
Absolutely. And what we don't want to do during the process is distract them from what they do best, because that can potentially hit the performance of the company. So insofar as it's possible, we take off the heavy lifting from them in terms of the analysis and some of the detailed work. They can then progress doing what they do best, running and growing their company. And so when the transaction comes to be completed, everything is continuing as expected.
Yeah. Well, I can see how important that advice would be for someone in that situation. Yeah. So let's sort of take a step back in time, as we always do towards the end of these podcasts. We like to work out a little bit. We always say there's no set path into this industry. There's no way that you can say do X, Y, Z and you will have a career in ABC. Everyone's got their own stories. So maybe just, can you give us a sense of your story? How did you end up doing what you're doing? What did you study at school? Did you go to university? Did you not? Give us a sense of your path.
So I did further maths and physics for A-levels, and then went on to study maths at Durham University. So a very mathematical focused path.
So you're the maths one.
Yes. Then I qualified as an accountant at Deloitte, and worked there for 4 years. Did all my accounting exams, and then I joined Helion about 2.5 years ago.
Got you. So I suppose for you, the choice was, I mean, with accountancy, I suppose there's a little bit more of a set path. It's kind of, if you do X, Y, Z, you will be an accountant of some sort. But I suppose then what flavour of accountant is a thing, isn't it? So what was it that made you choose to be this flavour of accountant, if you like?
I think the diversity within the industry, it's of all the industries to work in, it's very easy to have an interest in telly and in M&A. It's a lot more
M&A?
Mergers and acquisitions.
Got you, yeah.
So it's a lot more interesting for me to understand clients and what they get up to is watching the telly. Whereas I've got friends that's ball bearings and various parts of machinery, which is a lot less easy to get excited about.
Tell it's when you meet your friend for a drink or someone for the first time, you say, what do you do? And you say, I'm an accountant. And it's like, that can feel sometimes like there's no, when you say I'm an accountant who deals in film and television, they're like, oh, now I watch television.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a lot, it kind of, the conversation killer of I'm an accountant quickly goes away when you go into a little bit more detail about what it is you do.
Yeah, that very interesting. So that was your journey. So through maths, that's great. And Steve, what was yours?
My journey is an unusual one, I think, considering the role that I do now. So I trained originally as a musician, as a pianist and conductor, and graduated from the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. Had dalliances with child acting as a child and did some of that. But during my sort of music training and music career, I found that there were less opportunities to play concerts than I would have liked. So I started promoting concerts. So really my first interest in the sort of business of promoting and producing things started there. And then I worked from there in various theatrical sort of production companies, and spent a big portion of my career, a couple of decades, working for Bill Kenwright Limited. So the late great impresario Bill Kenwright, probably one of the most prolific theatre companies in the world, was also a film production studio and had myriad other investments and component parts. So I was working in that group, ran the group for a long time, but also have always been entrepreneurial. So I've been involved in several startups. I invest in companies constantly, and through a combination of that was pulled into several large M&A transactions to support on various aspects of that, and so found a route through to advising on M&A through really sort of that practical experience and a very eclectic early career.
So, which is again this thing we had time and time again of this, I call it the series of pebbles. It's just you jump to one and then you see what the opportunity is, you go to the next. And you don't see the path from the beginning, but looking back, you see the patterns.
Yeah.
And you just take the opportunities as they come. I suppose the question for you was, as someone who's sort of trained creatively in that way, there must have been a moment when you sort of went, right, I'm going to be the money guy. Do you know what I mean? Like, because actually for young people, there's often that is the missing link in a friendship group. You know, you've got loads, well, not loads, because young people find it difficult, especially to find other young people who they can make films with, which is why they come to Young Film Academy often. They meet like minds. But rarely is that young person who's like, don't worry about the budgets, guys. I'll handle the budget. I'll handle the fundraising. I'll handle the money side. Is that what you sort of earmarked and thought?
Yeah, that's there was certainly a point. So one of the things I look back on now fondly and without fear, though it took a while, is the first concert series I produced. And I wasn't going to do one concert. I was going to do a series because, you know, I know best. Of course I didn't. Was loss-making and had no external funding. I'd funded it entirely myself and I didn't have any money. So what that meant was credit cards and, you know, using next month's rent and so on and so forth to put on these concerts. And whilst some people bought tickets and there was some money coming in, it made a loss. And I always think of that as one of my best life lessons. Actually getting out and doing it, learning a big lesson. Don't use all your own money. Don't produce in isolation. All of those things that I've actually sort of learnt more thoroughly as I've been through my career as a producer for many years, and getting a really good grip on what the money means, because on the one hand there is accountancy, on the other hand there is running a business day to day and having to make relatively snap decisions about expenditure, how that money is going to be recorded, when it might be coming back in, the cash flows and all of those things, and learning about money through practical application and use, I found a very helpful part of my journey. And then layering on top of that more formal sort of education and learning and training sort of led me to where I was. So I think you're right. I don't think there's that many people who say to themselves and all of their friends, if they're putting a project together, I'm the money person. But actually, there's a great opportunity for anyone involved in a project just to be thoughtful about the money side of things and what that might mean going forward.
Yes, no, I totally agree. And I think, it's taken a little time in life, because I think, especially in school, when money's not, money's not a part of life in that real way, and that money can feel to young people a bit grubby somehow. Just the sense that it doesn't feel as wholesome. But actually, when you think about it, money is trust. Really, when you boil down to it, because money doesn't have any value until we all attribute value to it. I mean, it's that classic piece of economics. This pound coin is actually valueless until you believe that it's worth £1, and then you give it to Jess, and Jess passes it, and we all pass all the stuff on. But if we all stop believing in the system, if we don't think it's worth it, that's when everything collapses, because really it's built on sand. We're not part of the gold standard. It's a giant act of trust that I can go and give £5 to somebody, a £5 note, bit of paper, and someone can give me back a nice meal or whatever. There's an act of trust intrinsic in the giving and the receiving of money. And I suppose I've come in my life to sort of think, to see it a bit more like that, and trust and being a part of a group of people is one of the best things about this industry. It's working on projects with people with trust.
Yeah.
And I imagine that is a big part of everything that you guys do, is trust.
I think that's absolutely right. And you can imagine the trust involved when an owner is getting to the point of selling some or all of their business to another party. They need to not only trust in the new owner, but they need to trust in the process and the people advising them and that are around them, so that they know that they're basing their decisions on the right advice and the right information. And so part of what we do is become sort of information junkies, so that we're the best advice is always given when it's fed by the best information. And I think in working in life, trust is pretty much the ball game, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, our listeners all, when you guys come and you make your beautiful movies and you start your production companies and you have a future in this, you know where to go when you look to sell out to the big boys and make the big bucks. I'm sure you'll be going to Helion. So let's end, as we always end, with a little bit of time travel. So we're going to time travel back to teenagers. Jess, maybe we'll start with you. What would you, if you could time travel back, what would you be whispering into your teenage self's ear as a piece of advice looking back?
I think just to kind of trust the process and that everything will be okay. That keep working hard, and whatever happens, whether it's what you planned it to or not, it will all be all right.
Very good. And Steve, what would yours be?
I'd love to have an answer like Jess's. That was a great one. Excellent. It's a really good question. I mean, I agree with what Jess has said. I've always been a believer and an advocate of hard work. Trust the process is a good line from Jess. I'm definitely going to be using that going forward. Personally, for me, I think that there was a piece of my journey where I was less interested in trusting the process. So I wasn't particularly focused on school in my sort of GCSE days, actually, because I was more interested in learning music and doing other things. And I feel I've been extremely lucky in life because I've really always been doing the things that I want to do. But there's certainly been times now where I've backfilled the skill gaps and qualification gaps as I've worked more in finance. There's been a need to do that. So I suppose I look back and say, you probably could have worked harder at school, Steve, if you're honest with yourself and done that. But I also do believe that, people need to follow their own paths. They need to sort of discover. By discovering what they don't want to do, they might find a line of sight on what they do want to do, and go for it. Yeah,
that's brilliant. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of it, for sharing your experience in this world, and hopefully we've shined a bit of a light on the world of finance in movies and TV, and maybe it's not as dry as we might have thought it was. So huge thanks for joining us at the show. Thank you so much for coming on. Thanks to our partners Canon for having us live at the Media Production Technology Show at London Olympia. Look forward to seeing you next time.